the OG digital agency in Brussels.
And live from the internet, it's ZN Live. I'm Phil Weiss, CEO and founder of ZN, and this is episode 381. And I have at my side my co-anchor Gabby, who is an experienced AM with a talent for dancing as well, but has worked extensively on a number of different areas, including healthcare communication with the European Commission, with nurses, and a number of other projects. And we have Gary Finnegan, who's already been on the show before. We've known Gary for many years, over a decade, I believe. Gary is an experienced healthcare journalist. He's been writing about many topics with vaccines today, something we're very proud to be involved in, and also with WHO and a number of different projects. So, Gary, it's great to have you back on the show. And I want to start with a question, which is, the question about how are we doing today? What is the state of vaccine communication? Is it absolutely terrible or is it fantastic?
Yes, it's definitely in between those two. For one thing, there's a lot of fatigue around the subject. People thought about vaccines for the first time, maybe, but intensely. In that post-pandemic or pandemic period, and now everyone's a bit sick of it, to be honest. It's difficult to break through the noise. The fallout from the pandemic, when some people missed vaccines for practical reasons, or even because of some hesitancy, we're starting to see it. So there are measles outbreaks in several countries in Europe, pertussis outbreaks for the first time in a while, and some of those are quite big. But I always try to remind myself that most people are having most of their vaccines most of the time. It's often not enough, because you need 95% of people having their recommended measles vaccines to keep the disease down, because it comes back so quickly. But generally, most countries are pretty good. There is some improvement required, but it's not a disaster, I think.
Right. So we had an event last week, the European election, and we've seen a massive surge of the extreme right parties, but perhaps not as bad as intended, except perhaps in France, where we're seeing another election, because July is going to be the month of the elections, the UK and then France. Now, a lot of people say that the extremists were the ones who were the most active on social media, and we've seen that with some of their spending. And they're also the most polarizing. They tend to really benefit from extreme issues. And I think this is one of the spaces where vaccine communication doesn't do so well, because we don't want to be extreme. We want to be a little bit more calm and a little bit more fact-based. So I'm curious about how you feel about the impact of this election so far. And then, of course, we have the US election with Trump and Robert Kennedy, who might or might not talk more about vaccines. So are you concerned about the EU elections' impact and what's coming in the US?
I think there is a parallel between the vaccine situation and some of the political stuff, in the sense that if you look only on Twitter, where I spend too much time, you would think that it was going to be, 90% far right. Likewise, you would think lots of people are anti-vaccine, when really it's not as bad as all that. Even the French situation, that didn't happen over the past year because Elon Musk relaxed his approach to moderating on Twitter. That's been coming for years. It's a big trend. Didn't come out of nowhere. So I think the general uniting theme is not to overestimate what we see online. Because you can really get things out of proportion. As for the US, it might not be an issue in the US. Everyone's a bit tired of thinking about vaccines there too, but it has become much more political than elsewhere. And if someone like Robert Kennedy, who has flirted with anti-vaccine groups in the past, if he uses his platform to talk about vaccines, that could only be bad. Those diseases don't discriminate against Democrats or Republicans or anyone else. Vaccines are for everyone. It really should not be political.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I think the resilience to some degree, and underneath it all, people continue to get vaccinated. I think there's also been a genuine move since COVID from organizations and pro-vaccine networks to be much more active online and to really make an effort at improving communication. Um, but I think at the same time, we shouldn't underestimate the potential risk that, I think those measles epidemics, hopefully they're isolated incidents, but they could also be the trend of something worse to come. And I think, where the vaccine confidence question has absolutely not been settled. I think it's kind of this moving conversation where people are still confused. Some people might say, look, I don't mind vaccines, but I don't believe in COVID vaccine. That was, one of the pandemic story. And I think, again, there's still a lot of confusion around this. So in that context, you've obviously been writing about this and looking at it very closely. What do you think, who are the most effective people in getting the message on vaccines to the public? And, how do you rate the current campaigns from institutions, governments, and individuals so far?
Well, I think it's still health professionals. As much as I'd like trust in journalists or health authorities to be really high, it's always health professionals. Even for people who don't trust the medical establishment, whatever that means to them, they still trust the nurse they know, the pharmacist they know, their own GP. And I think you see a lot of the institutional stuff moving in that direction, where instead of a politician saying you should get your vaccines because XYZ, you find people trying to mobilize health professionals, but they need training and they need time. Everyone wants GPs and nurses to do more of everything. If we were talking about diabetes or women's health or anything, GPs should do more. So vaccines is just in a long queue. And apart from needing knowledge and answers to the technical questions about side effects or whatever, they also need communication skills. And here, training to communicate online, definitely, but also just that one-on-one conversation. And as I say, in a short consultation for most of these interactions, they have to be really efficient about it.
Yeah, and we've both been involved with the IPA, the International Pediatric Association, which has been doing some really interesting work in this space. Not only training people, having conferences where this is a big topic, but also doing online training, which the initiative that Dr. Naveen Thaker took to create this online training was very successful, with thousands and thousands of doctors taking it and actually saying it was quite useful. The other thing I think I'm seeing, but I don't know actually in detail how well it's going, is to build in training really in the beginning training of doctors and medical professionals, to say you have to include some of this. I think they're doing it through conferences and things like that, but I think they're also bringing it early. Have you seen interesting initiatives in that space from universities and training establishments?
There is some, but I think over time, the amount of time spent in undergraduate health education, even on vaccines in general, has gone down. Even though those diseases can be much more common than some of the say, genetic or cell-based therapies and things like this that are a bit trendier. So vaccines education needs more time in curriculum. But as I said, so does everything else. And within that, communication is a big part. I suppose you'd want communication and persuasion as a skill to be a bigger feature across medical education, not just vaccine communication, but everything, behavior change communication. Get people to eat more vegetables and run around from time to time. I mean, smoking cessation, these things are all the same psychological pathways. So yeah, a bit more on that would be great, but understanding that time is precious.
Yeah, I think, and we've seen this with, cognitive behavior and the kind of theory that's being discussed in these conferences. This is also a new field to some degree. It's been around for a long time, but I think it's kind of become much more visible. What kind of behavioral strategy can you deploy? So hopefully that, in combination with better understanding and different skills, will start bringing this forward. But as you said, there is a question of time, but I think it's also a question of priorities. It's the question is like, okay, if the doctors participate actively, hopefully it should have a direct impact on people's health, because you're going to see if they encourage people to exercise and eat better quality food and indeed get vaccinated, that might help really reduce the burden on the healthcare system in governments, which I guess is one of the big challenges. Now, how do we communicate this to people? So if we're talking about healthcare professionals, that's one great way of doing it. We've also seen a lot of initiatives from governments to communicate on vaccines and other topics. How do you think they're doing at those initiatives? And because basically there's a very low trust in government for the moment, I think that's manifested with most elections we're seeing. So do you think that's money well spent? Do you think it works? And what would be your advice to those organizations and institutions?
Well, I think moving politics away from the persuasive element of vaccine uptake is really important. Just as we said, seeing anti-vaccine politicians is unhelpful. It's better to have this done by health authorities. But even where they're not well trusted, I think it's useful to have other stakeholders. I know is overused word, but other social actors. My favorite campaign was on vaccines was when the HPV vaccine uptake went down in Ireland. And rather than just having the government say, you really should get this vaccine, they had about 40 organizations with their logos on a single campaign. And it wasn't just GPs and pharmacists, it was also cancer societies, it was women's health groups, it was children's rights alliances, teachers, and there was something for everyone. Probably you trust the pharmacist, but even if you don't, you might trust the schools or you might trust someone else. So I just thought seeing that united front was better than seeing the logo of your health authority, who you may or may not have high levels of trust in.
Yeah, I think that's the network approach is really interesting, and I think this is something that we need to get better at organizing, because if you hear different voices that basically align but often don't make the effort to communicate, I think that's one of the issues. In terms of channels, you spend a lot of time on X, and I think one of the big, I guess, surprises, especially for an EU focused crowd, was that X is still around and still being used by experts, journalists, policymakers, despite LinkedIn being used a lot by a certain group of people, but it really hasn't displaced X in any way. What are your feelings about different channels? Do you think, TikTok is a terrible place to go, or where do you stand on that?
Well, I suppose we've always tried to be agnostic about it and go where the people are. And at the moment, I definitely, as you said, people are still on X or whatever we're supposed to call it. So yeah, it hasn't really gone so bad. I see he turned off the visibility of likes now, and likes went up. So sometimes counterintuitive things happen. We all think, he's broken Twitter, but somehow it keeps on going. So as long as there's an audience, I mean, I opened a Blue Sky account and I opened some, all these things. What was the other one that was going to take over everything? Began with M.
Threads. There's Threads,
Mastodon I had and still have dormant somewhere. Threads has some chance, I guess, because it's linked to an established platform. But yeah, it's quite a resilient platform because everyone was already there before he broke it. So I'm still there too.
Gary, what do you think are the risks of using the different platforms? Because of course we do have Facebook, we have LinkedIn, the most popular ones, X, of course. What do you think are the risks of using and benefits of using those platforms for health communications?
I guess the risks are, as they've been for a while, that you'll get some negative feedback and so on. But I suppose if I go back about 10 years or so to when Vaccines Today went on those channels, first it was Twitter, then it was Facebook. And Facebook is still a pretty wild place for some of the time, I know. But we possibly overestimated or just couldn't accept the risk involved in potentially having someone say mean things about us or about our topic. And now we just accept this, and we view it now as a greater risk to not be there. And I think we're at the stage where, you know, and I know you guys talk about this all the time, but really you have to be there before, during, and after the crisis. You can't just show up and say, listen to me. You need to build an audience and build trust. And so I think having health professionals, to go back to them again, online and just actively communicating on all the things that matter to them, including hopefully vaccines, is part of a resilient health communication ecosystem. But yeah, you got to be, and we have been there for years. We arrived after the H1N1 pandemic, and so we were there when COVID happened, and it would have been very difficult to start from zero in the middle of a crisis. So as you guys have said many times, the only risk is that everyone disappears now and doesn't come back until the next crisis. So we sort of hope that people will just stay active and stay engaged.
And I see how on the social media, I see the rise of the communications from healthcare professionals. I think that connects very well with the question that Phil asked in the beginning, how healthcare professionals, they need to learn how to communicate. But we also see that in different ways, whatever they learned is one way or another, they are actually starting to communicate, especially on such platforms like LinkedIn. Do you believe that's a good way forward? If not in any other way, that they at least communicate on social media?
Yeah, I think so. And if you go back 10 years in terms of the risk that they felt, they didn't really know what the professional guidelines or ethical implications were of being online and recommending anything, because some of the rules that they follow are quite strict. So there was a lot of fear. But then bit by bit, you see success stories and they see colleagues doing it. It's no good us telling them to do it, or, you know, a health authority. They need to see a few examples of other doctors and nurses. And now they're doing it and it just feels normal. Plus, it's a normal part of lots of people's daily life. They're talking about the sandwich they ate, and then they're worried about their kid, and then they're talking about the patient they just saw, and they just saw the measles outbreak in Romania, so they mentioned that. And I think that's a much better way to present it as part of a human experience online. You know, we talk about vaccines all the time, but I do think seeing a health professional with a face who's a normal person is really more effective than anything else that an institution can do.
Yeah, I think it's what you said at the beginning, you know, that it's important to have a permanent presence on these different channels. And I think this is the difficult leap, because you kind of need to say, okay, this is for the long run. We are investing, we're building a community, we're building a narrative. And we've seen this with many clients in different areas, which is if they are there and present, then it means when an issue comes up, it's okay. They then have to adapt the messaging and figure out what to say. But it feels like 70% of the work is already done. If you come in last minute, you know, like if you start communicating because of COVID, it feels like you're just an advocate for a specific vaccine. Whereas if you've been there before, you're a credible voice at the table. So I think that's a really interesting point, and it's really important to continue communication after that. I think there's also a tendency of people to think that you know, now that all these crises are over, it's back to the old way of, you know, behind the scenes conversations and all this social media stuff and all these AI, all these words are still, you know, I hear the same. Some people saying, well, you know, now it's actually all about face to face and behind the scenes and all that. And it's like, wait a minute, you know, of course this is important, but that's a really other big part of the story. You need the narrative to frame the bigger narrative online with regular communication. And as you said, even if people attack you, that's not a problem, because if they're attacking you, they're giving you visibility and oxygen. What do you think?
I was thinking when you were talking about doctors online with audiences, one of my favorites is a guy you trained years ago called Dr. Mihai Craiu in Romania.
Yeah.
And so he's a pediatrician, and he's on TV and he's on radio. So it's not just his Facebook channel, but I think he has about 350,000 people. But he talks about infectious diseases, but also about injuries and child development and speech and language, everything. And people just trust him. So he was active in the pandemic, but he's also active on the measles outbreak. And it's just to what you're saying about just being an established, ongoing contributor to sort of dialogue that people are interested in.
Yeah, and I think if you think about it, this is how communication always works. Where are the sources of authority that you believe? And if you don't believe in governments, or if at least if your trust is low, you need alternative places, and they need to come through multiple channels, not the official channel through a press release. You really need that fragmentation. So when you meet people who come to you and say, Gary, I want to start a career in healthcare journalism, communication, what is your big tip for them? What do you tell them to do?
Get into banking. No, I'm always a bit hesitant to give advice, to the youth, because it's always going to be based on the past. But I think, as I said earlier on, kind of staying agnostic about tech trends, because you can always adapt. And the main advice is just to stick with first principles of storytelling, because in the end, that's like built in, that's a feature of human nature that won't change. So, you need stories in novels and films and advertising, and every campaign you've ever run needs characters, it needs a story arc. It needs a bit of tension. That's why questions are so impactful on online articles. So I think that the fundamental principles of storytelling are the thing you really need to understand. And once you do, you can adapt and apply that to whatever technology throws at us.
And are you optimistic about the future of communication for vaccines?
Oh, I am really. I think I have to say, optimism bias is strong in me. But I think last time I was here, we were talking about Chat GPT because it was so new. And I had tested it out and asked it questions on vaccines, and it was actually pretty good. And I think obviously it's died down, the hype has eased a little bit, but overall, there are things that will be difficult with those types of AI, or if we're supposed to call them AI, those large language models.
Mhm.
But I think they're going to improve things like chatbots. We tried to make one years ago as part of this WHO project, and it was slow and imprecise, but that is going to accelerate so much now. And there are ways that people can get answers to simple questions and just get on with it. Because most people who don't vaccinate, it's either because it's inconvenient, or because they have a question that they're a bit uncertain about. And if you can end the uncertainty as simply as possible, I think that's great. And technology will be part of that.
Yeah, and we've been involved in projects where we're using some AI tools to basically, look at information, help understand it, so you can have these chatbots, and then translate them so that you can have conversations across different channels. Now, it comes with a big health warning, because it is not always 100% correct. So that's a little bit of a struggle, but it is kind of getting better and better, quite quickly in terms of improvement cycles. So I think this is going to be tremendously helpful. There's quite a lot of tech needed to kind of frame the data set and not go out, and I don't know if you've seen the latest Google attempt to include Google searches and AI responses, where Google was telling you to eat rocks and to put glue in your pizza to hold the cheese together. So you say, okay, not quite there yet, needs a bit of debugging. So we don't want those kind of things to come in. But at the same time, I think there are ways to do it, and we have to just accept that there isn't going to be perfection in the outcomes. So now we have time for some recommendations. Sorry, we have a jingle. Okay, roll jingle. Thank you, team. So, Gary, what is your recommendation for our viewers this week?
How many can I have? I have a few. I have. Quite like the WHO podcast, Health in Europe. I think that's great. The Coalition for Life Course Immunization podcast is new and it's good. And I'm biased because I present it. And my favorite website of the week. This is very specific and niche to vaccine comms, but is Infodemiology, which shows you dashboards of what's trending and questions people are asking. So you can kind of see an outbreak at a communication side before there's the outbreak of the disease, because people are searching for things. And this has been attempted a few times, but it's a really good one, I think. And then my last one is a game called Cranky Uncle Vaccine, and it's quite good fun. You know this one, and it's about combating misinformation. Sort of teaches you to convince your skeptical uncle to see things from a more rational point of view, and it apparently is quite effective. It does change people's behavior, supposedly. It's been trialed in lots of different countries in Africa and other places. So Cranky Uncle Vaccine, check that one out.
Fantastic. So you can do that for all your cranky relatives and address all topics that they're cranky about.
Yeah, so not just uncles, cranky aunties, who knows? Anti-vaccine, you know.
Cranky grandmas, everybody.
The whole lot. That one started for climate deniers, actually, and they sort of mapped it over onto vaccines. So all sorts of science skepticism can be tackled.
Yeah, and you know, I think coming back to the optimism question again, if we keep looking at how to use these tools in a positive, constructive way, there's a lot you can do. And I think, you know, the negative side tends to get massive visibility, and people say, "Oh my God, AI is going to kill us all," and then they get bored. So instead of saying, "Hey, look at that, actually it kind of works," it's like, "Nah, this is not interesting because we're not all going to die in a kind of Skynet Terminator type of scenario." So Gabby, what are your recommendations for the week?
I have two recommendations. One is a podcast called This Week in Virology. It's a podcast where professors like Vincent Racaniello and Dixon Desplumier and others speak to different guests. And usually when I listen to every podcast episode, there's a different virus that they discuss. And they have more than 1,000 episodes now. And I love it because I think it's very important, what we discussed today as well, it's very important to reach the audience, that the audience understands the information that you are trying to convey. And that podcast is really aimed at everyday people who don't have a medical background, who don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge in healthcare. And it's really, really interesting from my side as an everyday person. And of course, I have another recommendation. We have mentioned it a couple of times today, but I'm going to make a product placement now. We've been working with Gary Gary's been working on it for more than a decade, as you've already mentioned. I've been working with Gary and the whole team at Zeden as well, and on Gary's side for more than 3 years now on Vaccines Today, a platform where people can get on and learn more about vaccines, learn about the importance of it, and how we should, always keep and stay vaccinated.
Fantastic.
Nice. I second that. Thanks, Gabby.
Absolutely. And my recommendation for this week is a book called Imaginable, and it's a kind of future casting book. Now, I have to give a disclaimer. I haven't actually read the book, but I listened to a long conversation between the author on a podcast and someone else. And it's all about the future trends, the forecasting of future trends. So I don't know if we have it here, but it's called Imaginable, and the author is Jane McGonigal. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. And basically, it's imagining futures and then building scenarios. And they apparently, in 2013, did a disease that would spread from China simulation, and essentially went through pretty much all the key things that happened in COVID, including what do you do when you have to wear a mask? What is going to happen when people are afraid that the supply chain is being disrupted? And so they had basically mapped this out. And she said, doing this exercise is so interesting because it creates a much more prepared mindset, because you kind of say, well, I've imagined this, and they spend months building these scenarios, trying to think of all the different things that might happen. And so they did it exactly 10 years before COVID. And they had actually said, what if this happened 10 years from now? So it's kind of interesting. But again, it's this idea that you have to constantly think about different possible futures, what you can do to kind of address potential problems that maybe, we haven't thought about yet. So that's all we have time for on this not quite beautiful weekend. But I think for you, both in different countries, you might have better weather than in Brussels. Have a fantastic weekend, and we will see you online. And for those who don't know, you can already put in your agenda on the 20th of September, the EU Influencer event is coming. So more on that on our channels. Looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gabby. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.